You can almost say, and I know you've been waiting for this,
Class systems are complicated!
Yes, comrades, the revolution is finally here. However, the revolution will not be televised, not shown on this video. You can serve the revolution by sharing this video anywhere and everywhere. How did we get from a slave society to a free one, from feudalism to capitalism? Fiction is often about radical change in the social order, especially sci-fi and fantasy, and class systems are an important element of realizing your world's history and why your world is the way it is. Understanding this sort of thing can give your world that little bit of extra depth. So, let's talk about how class systems fall, or change, but fall sounded more dramatic, so I wanted to say that. We're going to do this in 5 parts. Peaceful change, violent change, what happens after class, plague, and war. Oh, and a cheers to the writing and world building software Campfire for sponsoring this video. We'll be reviewing it later. Part 1. Peaceful change. Class systems can change or end when the barriers to class mobility significantly lower, allowing people to cross into different classes easily, and this is either up or down. Thus, the class system as they know it ceases to exist. Like, I don't know, imagine if millennials could no longer buy a house, a critical part of entering the middle class. A good example of this is from the Tang dynasty. The competitive civil service examination system for the recruitment of the members of the ruling class accounted for the decline of the pre-Tang and early Tang aristocracy. The Chinese examination system made it radically easier for non-nobles to enter the ruling class. Here, those barriers to ruling of being rich, noble, or already powerful were undermined by a new political religious idea to the point that it marked the decline of an old aristocracy. It was a massive shift in the class system of the day.
What is this? Poor people getting an education? Not on my watch!
A major factor to consider here are guilds and unions, which have been important players in breaking down, changing, or even reinforcing barriers to social mobility historically. We see how this works in the Elder Scrolls series. The emergence of the Fighters Guild lent power, wealth, and status to laymen under a feudalistic system that they otherwise would not have. Members have legal exemptions for weapons, can demand higher payments for jobs, and are well respected. Guilds and unions give people a lot of bargaining power that challenge the way the class system works. Consider what unique privileges of power, wealth, and status that guilds and unions give its members. Guilds and unions, like the UK miners in the 1980s, have used their control of a large portion of the economy to boycott or pressure government bodies to enact laws that they want. Both unions and guilds increase the social mobility of their members, but they can also restrict the social mobility of non-members by either denying membership or resisting change that would disadvantage them, becoming part of the strictures of a new class system themselves. The Lies of Lochlamora by Scott Lynch alludes to how guilds can become so powerful manipulative of individuals in its world building. One night a powerful sorcerer knocks on the door of a less powerful sorcerer. "Hey, I'm starting an exclusive guild," he says. "Join me now or I'll blast you out of your boots right where you stand." So naturally the second mage says, "You know, I always wanted to join a guild." Right, repeat as necessary until 300 or 400 guild members are knocking on the door of the last independent mage around, and everyone who said no is dead. In other words,
class systems are complicated!
A second way that class systems peacefully change or end is if the philosophy behind how the class system should work changes. Government programs in both Japan and India working to help low-caste people who have been historically discriminated against reflect a changing belief in the validity of the caste system. Even in 1984, Dr. Abraham Thomas wrote, "Does caste exist in India? Sure it does, but not the same as it was 200 years ago, or even 100 or even 20 years ago." For an example from our modern day society, journalist Ben Tarnoff writes, "Today's top executives are devoted work worshippers. These individuals aren't working out of necessity. It's about the display of productivity as a symbol of class power. In an era of extreme inequality, elites need to demonstrate to themselves and others they deserve to own orders of magnitude more wealth than everyone else." What we're seeing is that our own class system, which largely accepted inherited wealth, is now changing as political and economic tensions begin to climb to emphasize non-inherited wealth. Our definition of status is changing, and the class system is too. But these are good changes, right? Well, a lot of these are. The Nazis are also an example of people changing their philosophy to believe in a class system based on racial hierarchy and loyalty to the state. Not all social change is good, so consider 1. Positive changes to the distribution of wealth, power, and status, and 2. Negative changes to the distribution of wealth, power, and status across history. Part 2. Violent change. Finally, the more exciting stuff. Why would you have healthy, gradual class change when you can have blood? Now, revolution and civil war happened for a myriad of reasons, so we're just going to focus on the class aspects of it. Class tensions are major internal economic and political forces in society, so it's no surprise that the 1917 Russian Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, the Finnish Civil War, the Chinese Revolution, and so many others are underpinned by class tensions. The different sides aren't just ideologically different, but economically different, though lower class people are of course conscripted to either side without much choice. Charles Dickens explored this in his book A Tale of Two Cities. He goes out of his way to highlight the economic and social divide that led up to the French Revolution, more than he did the ideas of liberty, justice, and blah blah blah, all that sort of nonsense, which is what we often talk about when we think of the French Revolution. See, though historical, it was important world building to help us believe and understand how the revolution was inevitable or realistic. Those idealistic concepts might be there for your heroes, but the average working person is more concerned with peace, bread, and land before they're thinking about those higher ideas. Popular support for violent class change doesn't spring out of nowhere. Consider showing the economic tensions that underpin the divide, and more importantly, the economic reform that both sides believe need to happen. And whether peaceful or violent, it's important to consider whether the change is top-down or bottom-up. So, you know how in Shakespeare's Hamlet, actually, no, let's go with the Lion King, otherwise known as Hamlet, but fluffy. Scar rules the land, placing the hyenas higher in the class system than they ought to be, and the land suffers for it. But then, Simba becomes king and he heals the land from a position of wealth, power, and status. This is a top-down change. In contrast, The Slaves at the Mastery by William Nicholson shows a radical slave society being overthrown by a class of enslaved people who have no power, wealth, and little status. This is bottom-up change. Now, in fiction, these two different types of change provide for usually different types of stories. Top-down change stories allow for lost heirs to the throne, a more idealistic ending like The Return of the King, where defeating a bad ruling class solves the problems without worrying too much about the more complex real-world questions. And that's okay, not every story needs to go into this sort of stuff. It's also important to know that real-world top-down change is often a little out of touch with reality because fewer people are involved in making decisions, and this can lead to economic and social problems. In contrast, bottom-up change stories typically allow for underdog characters, revolutionary tales like Mistborn, where the arc is them acquiring wealth, power, and status till they can challenge the status quo. Real-world bottom-up change is grassroots democracy, but it's also often more violent because it naturally brings those without power, wealth, and status into conflict with those who do. Though, historically an important factor in this type of change is some support from the top in some form. Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins explores this through Plutarch Heavensbee, who works with the resistance from the capital to get Katniss out. Part 3. After Class. Littlefinger was right when he said, "Chaos is a ladder." In A Storm of Swords by George R. R. Martin, Daenerys overthrows the slave-driven class system of Astapor. Chaos was left in its wake. Now, Daenerys did set up a council to rule the city with a semi-egalitarian class system, but it doesn't stick. A group of ex-slaves, now a free class, forcefully take power and the council cannot stop it. See, the council doesn't really control the city's resources or the military, not really, but this faction of ex-slaves become a strong enough force to do so. See, class isn't just an idea. Class is about the realistic and practical distribution of power, wealth, resources, opportunities, social standing. So, a change in the class system is often just really about a redistribution of those things to different groups of people, creating a new class system, which may be better or worse. As for how that happens, think about which group practically controls resources and military force afterwards. They will form an important part of the new social class order, regardless of the war or revolution's idealistic aims. It's about who has the infrastructure to support them afterwards. Think about Kuvira in The Legend of Korra. She takes over after an anarchist plot decimates the ruling class of Ba Sing Se, the capital. She's a military leader, and the military is one of the only factions left with a nationwide organizational infrastructure left. They pick up the pieces, and who is there to challenge them? The French Revolution is famous for turning to tyranny in its aftermath. See, a new class system will often form out of the remnants of the last, especially if there is chaos or violence. This is also a really fascinating place for a story, a post-revolution world where they're trying to realize these revolutionary ideals, but it's more complicated than that. This is kind of the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. It's after the revolution, trying to realize these new ideals and things go pretty wrong pretty quickly. You could take a deep look at what a world is like from the perspective of people who didn't have any wealth, power, or status before and suddenly find themselves in a new order where they have too much of it, or too little of it. The reality is class isn't simple. No.
Class systems are complicated.
Realistically, class systems change, but they always leave a remnant of the past of sorts. Frank Herbert's Dune series sees the fall of the Farfarug feudalistic system, which uses terms like lord, viceroy, and duke, but these terms survive the class system's end, and they evolve in what they mean in the book Heretics of Dune. Everything doesn't just suddenly change like that. We can see the history and how he world built this new kind of class system. The question for you as the world builder is this: what class systems did your society go through in the past, and how is that reflected now, linguistically, socially, and economically? Part 4. Plague. During the feudal age, peasants were replaceable labour.
Help! Help! I'm being repressed! Bloody peasant!
But after the Black Plague, that wasn't so true anymore, forcing the feudalistic class system to change to give them wages, wealth, and their skills were rarer, giving them a kind of status. The nobility did try to stop this with immense taxes and the Statute of Labourers in 1351, but economic and social pressures won out and succeeded over time with the end of feudalism. So, firstly, plague can change the economic worth of large classes of individuals as their skills become more valuable during and after the plague, giving them leverage in changing the class system. Secondly, people fled the cities during the Black Plague to the countryside, the rich and the poor. The result was a decentralization of power across Europe as cities declined. Where disease has struck historically will shift the geographical centers of power, wealth, and status, like capital cities in your world, as the upper class either flees or they die and new powers rise up. Thirdly, this is all intensified by disease impacting lower income families more on average. Tolkien wrote about a great plague across Middle-earth that was greater in Rhovanion, which had no great cities. Its people were little skilled in the arts of healing and medicine. Lower classes or less advanced civilizations lack healthcare, have fewer resources, and often an inability to self-isolate. This means that there may be differences in the class system distribution of wealth, power, and status depending on where the disease strikes. The working class of the place hit hardest may be able to demand more in the post-disease world, leading to an emergent middle class. Part 5. War. War challenges the class system in a similar way to how plague does, as people, shockingly, die. World War I meant that those who had previously been part-timers or casual labourers or unemployed could suddenly earn good money and feed themselves. However, it also challenges the class norms that underpin wealth, power, and status. In Britain, women became an employed class in factories and shops to help the war effort, and it meant that they demanded the vote, getting power. But the relationship between class and war also heavily depends on how popular the war is. As York University history professor Gerald Jordan wrote, conscription and the direction of labour made for a more inclusive sense of national identity in 1914 Britain. Nationalism was one legacy of the war. Although war sensitized workers to class inequality, nationalist sentiments in popular culture set limits on the political consequences of class feeling. War can give a cultural feeling of purpose to inequalities. It can be used by the powers that be to quell those tensions, or create a sense of a bigger picture. But this doesn't always work. In contrast, Russia. In World War I, they had long work hours, the cost of living were already an issue, and they were made worse due to the demands of the war, and it all contributed to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks promised peace, bread, and land, and that's because when you strip away the facade of idealistic concepts of justice and equity, people just want to go home and have stability. If there are class tensions, then how popular is that war? Which tensions is it making worse, and which is it easing? Though I do want to note that war doesn't usually stop these tensions, it just puts them on pause for a few years, often then returning with a vengeance. Seriously, go read about how many strikes there were in Germany in World War I during the war and then after the war. All of it leading up to, well, you know what. And if you want to codify or visualize your class system alongside your magic system, species, or world timeline, then Campfire and their worldbuilding expansion allows you to have an encyclopedia, which would make it pretty easy to lay out how your class structure works and how different groups perceive their wealth, power, and status. It's a software designed for writing and world building, and I've already done an extensive review of Campfire before. It's linked up in the corner now, because I want to be really open and honest when talking about this sort of thing. But bottom line, Campfire and the expansion is really good, especially if you're world building magic systems and languages. I mean, look at this page, it's awesome. I really do think it would be a great place for you to get down just how your class system works, and more importantly, how it intersects with the rest of your world building, because Campfire is really built to be able to do that. Campfire does have a 10-day totally free trial down at the link below, so I encourage you to go check it out and just see if it helps you, and if you like it, it's only a one-time purchase, which I really appreciate in the era of subscription services. There's also a fantastic timeline feature for you to map out how your class system evolved over time, which I think is a really important part. I do think the encyclopedia could be better integrated with the map so that you click on locations and it brings articles up, and the map could use different icons like cities and mountains, castles, and spaceships, but I do mean this when I say that I recommend Campfire as a way to organize your world building and connect it all together, especially for role players, by the way, as the item and character pages are really equipped for D&D style stats. Links are down below, you get a cool world building software, and it supports the channel. And for the summary, I'm gonna channel my Year 3 English teacher. Alright class, what have we learned today? Tim, get that out of your mouth! Firstly, peaceful ways class systems change include lowering barriers to social mobility and people changing their beliefs about the justification of social stratification. Guilds and unions are often important players in reinforcing or challenging the status quo. Consider what kind of story you really have, and whether the change should be top-down or bottom-up to fit that. Secondly, revolution and civil war often have sides that come from broadly different economic classes. Likewise, however idealistic your conflict is, showing the economic tensions underpinning the violent class divide helps with realism. Thirdly, consider which groups control the resources, infrastructure, and military after a radical shift in the class system, especially if there's chaos. They will be an important part of the new class system, holding some combination of wealth, power, and status, regardless of the idealistic aims. Fourthly, class systems may change, but remnants of the history will always remain. Consider how past class systems are reflected in the language, organization, political structures, and otherwise. Fifthly, plague significantly impacts whose skills grow in value, giving them more leverage. It will also change the geographical concentration of wealth and power as cities decline and different groups are affected more, weakening or strengthening their place in the class system. And sixthly, war can mobilize groups into the economy, leading to their political agency. It can exacerbate economic tensions, and it can lead to nationalistic unity depending on the popularity of the war. All I've got to say now is join the revolution, share this video far and wide to spread the revolution. It is here at last. Yes, and you can be part of it. Your revolution needs you. I'm done. This topic was hard. Thought it was going to be one video, then it was two. Thought it was going to just be 2 videos, then it was 3. And I'm actually done now. I think. Yeah, I'm done. I'm good. I'm gonna go get a drink and a cookie, and you can't stop me. Instagram and Twitter are down below. Come follow me there. In the meantime, I hope I've taught you the most important thing, and that is... class systems are complicated.
Must crush capitalism.